because of the time of year and what's going on in our nation right now, there's a lot of churches that have series like these where let's see what the Bible says about politics. And the ones I've heard for the most part, not with a few very refreshing exceptions, but for the most part they leave me a little frustrated because they seem to fall in one of a couple categories. Number one, hey, the Bible says submit to those that are in the rule over you. That's it. Okay, first, the Bible has much more to say about our relationship with the governing authorities. Much more to say. It's much more to say about our responsibilities as Christians in our society. Or for churches that are very, let's be honest, it works like this. If I'm a church and I really want to reach people that aren't Christians, right? What do I know about people in Middletown that aren't Christians? Somebody's voting Democrat, right? It's probably not people that are in church this morning, by and large. For the most part, evangelical votes go towards the Republican Party. So if I'm a pastor and I really want to reach people, and I know they've got this hang-up, well, if I'm a Christian, that means I got to be a Republican. Then there's a tendency for pastors to turn these political type messages into saying something like this, listen, it doesn't matter. Politics is not the kingdom of God, and it doesn't matter which way you vote. You can still be a Christian. And I've heard many sermons that are essentially bending over backwards, pastors doing all sorts of gymnastics to try to make a case to say, it doesn't really matter how you vote if you're a Christian. You can still be a Christian. Well, frankly, I'm not interested in offering an apologetic for any political party in the world. I'm not up here to tell you that as a Christian you can vote for anybody. I find it ironic, almost nobody would think that if the election was, say, 1932 in Germany. Would you say you can vote for any political party that comes in your mind? It's like, well, I don't think so. And so it's not the point of these messages is not to try to say, hey, listen, you can do whatever you're doing politically, no big deal. You can still be a Christian. Instead, I wanted to explore what scriptures actually call us to do, what our responsibilities are as Christians. And these are much more expansive than just voting or not voting or whatever. So look at a few verses in the book of Proverbs. We're going to skip around a little bit, which we don't normally do. It's an unusual message, and it's the book of Proverbs, which is an unusual book. So if we'll start chapter 3, and then we're going to hop a couple times. So if you can follow along, we'll start in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. Verse 9. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. Turn over a few pages to chapter 13. Chapter 13, verse 22. 13, verse 22. A good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children, but a sinner's wealth is stored up for the righteous. Let's go over a few more pages to chapter 21. Chapter 21. Chapter 21, verse number 20. The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down. Okay, a couple more pages. Chapter 23. Chapter 23. Starting in verse 24. The father of a righteous child has great joy. A man who fathers a wise son rejoices in him. May your father and mother rejoice. May she who gave you birth be joyful. Okay, next page, chapter 24, starting in verse 30. Chapter 24, verse 30. Last one. I went past the field of a sluggard, past the vineyard of someone who has no sense. Thorns had come up everywhere. The ground was covered with weeds, and the stone wall was in ruins. I applied my heart to what I observed, and I learned a lesson from what I saw. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man. This is the word of the Lord. So I should do a little imagination experiment with me today. Imagine you get a phone call today, a good phone call, and it says you have inherited a vast estate. Okay? You got to move out to, somewhere. You got to move out to where this estate is, and you got to take it over. And you get out there, and it comes with a fortune, beautiful house and grounds, and all these people who are employed there on the grounds, and it's really almost like a business. The estate is so large. And it's got a reputation in the community. This place has been there for 200 years, has a reputation, and people are proud of it in the community. People that work there are proud to have worked there. This is a gift from God. A lot of you would be pretty excited to get a phone call like that today, to have inherited something like that. And you would say, wow, praise God, he's given me this wonderful gift. So here's my question. You've received that. Are you free to do with that whatever you want to do? Are you free to just do whatever? To say, I'll just sell this to whoever will give me the most money. Or, I'm going to tear down all these buildings. I'm going to build a big factory here or something like that. Or I'm going to take all this money and I'm going to go squander it or waste it however I want. Are you free to do whatever you want to do? Or do you have certain duties that come with this gift that God has given you? And I think based on the Proverbs we've read today, and I hope just your instinct as you hear that would say, no, there's certain responsibilities that come with receiving a gift, an inheritance, a fortune like that. Good gifts from God are not to be squandered. Instead, they put an obligation on us to steward them well. So any gift that you have, any gift that God has given you, creates an obligation. Okay, the simplest one of these is children. Children are an inheritance from the Lord. If God has given you children, congratulations, that comes with responsibilities. That comes with duties. You can't just be like, well, I'll just do whatever I want. Like, no, you can't. There's a rule book for this. You've received these children, and now you have to use them rightly. Now, the way we tend to do this is we try to say, okay, I've got a responsibility. Let me just find the commands, simple commands in the Bible that just say straight up what I'm supposed to do. So we were talking about money. If I inherit $1 million today, what's the first command that's going to come in my mind? Oh, I better tithe on that. I better tithe to the Lord. I've received this gift, and now I better tithe, right? But does that mean that the other $900,000, I'm free to just do whatever I want with? No, that's not how stewardship works. As Christians, the tithe is just a token, but we recognize God's ownership over all. Whatever you keep, you still have to acknowledge it's not yours, right? That we are stewards for the Lord. Stewardship is broader. And I think we would include the following things. I'll just name a couple things. Appreciation. If you don't appreciate what you've got, you're not a good steward. You don't appreciate, wow, this is a really wonderful thing. If you turn up your nose at it, or you just kind of act like it's no big deal, you receive this fortune, this great gift, and you don't act like it's any big deal, you're not a very good steward. Stewardship starts with appreciation. I appreciate gratitude for what I've received. Then it moves into preservation. I'm going to keep it around. I'm not going to let it just be squandered or disappear or wasted. I'm going to make sure that I use it, that I keep it around, right? Simplest is, you got your kids today, I hope you still have your kids tomorrow, right? You need to hold on to them. Don't lose them, right? If you lose your kids, you're not being a very good steward, right? If you lose them permanently. We've all lost our kid for 10 minutes at IKEA before, right? At least I have. But stewardship is about not losing your kids permanently. It's about holding on to a good gift that God's given you. Then it's about how you use them. Do you use the power that this good gift has given you in a way that honors the Lord? If God gives me $900,000 or $1 million, whatever it is, am I going to use it in a way that honors Him? Say, I have to use this not just for my own selfishness, make my wish list of everything that I want. Instead of saying, okay, I've got this money. How would God have me to use this? How can I honor Him with what He's given me? And the last thing of stewardship I'd point out, the last action of stewardship, is to work for its increase. Wise people, whatever you give them, this is something the book of Proverbs teaches. Wise people, whatever you give them, they want to make more of it. Right? If you give them $1 million, they're going to say, oh, how do I turn this into $1,001,000? How do I increase what God has given me? And your children grow, right? God's given you children, your children grow. They become strong men and women. That's increase. And then they have children, right? So it's not just, I'm just happy with keeping what I have. Bury my talent, as Jesus said in the parable. I want what God has given me to increase. Okay, so look at those four things. Appreciation, preservation, wise use, or God-honoring use, and increase. Now, how are you going to do that? Well, that requires wisdom. You're not going to find step-by-step instructions in the Bible about how you should spend your $1 million. It's just not in there. There's not instructions for how to do that. Instead, you require wisdom. And wisdom, we can just say, is a deep application of truth. My whole mind and heart has been shaped by truth so that certain things make sense to me and I act in that way. How does wisdom begin? The book of Proverbs tells us, what's the beginning of wisdom? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord means a deep respect, reverence for God. Everything starts with, I know who God is, I tremble before God, I respect him, I honor him. But wisdom expands. That's the starting point. That's the alpha point of wisdom. Wisdom starts with, I know who God is. But wisdom in the book of Proverbs, I love the book of Proverbs because it just gets into everything. It talks about every little corner of life, even little corners of life that we think aren't important. And wisdom explores every area. So if you're a Christian, you have the beginning of wisdom because you know the Lord. You're here this morning on Sunday morning because you fear the Lord. You're here to worship him. That's the beginning of wisdom. But wisdom's job is never done. Wisdom wants to seep out into every nook and cranny of our lives until all of my life is lived in wise stewardship. Now, in a political discussion, I want to show the relevance of this, is that in our nation, we have inherited something. Not just us in our country. I'm not just trying to be America-centric. I'd say the same thing if I was teaching this lesson in Taiwan. If you're in a country, you've inherited that. It's a gift from God to you. And so the question is, are we going to be wise stewards of what God has given us? Are we going to appreciate what God has given us? Are we going to preserve what God has given us? Are we going to honor God in the way we use it? And are we going to increase what God has given us? That means we're going to need wisdom. If you're just looking in the Bible for what does the Bible command me to do in my country, you're going to come up with a list that's way too short. Because it's not just about finding the simple commands. Instead, it's about the wisdom of God seeping in every part of my life. Every question of life, I want to be thinking about the wisdom of God. So it starts with what? We're going to look at here in the book of wisdom. Proverbs is the book of wisdom. And we're going to try to find these proverbs that describe what wise stewardship looks like in these areas. And we're trying to consider, are we being wise stewards? So let's talk about first appreciation. Honoring the Lord for what he has given us. Look at the first proverb we read. I'll read it for you again in case you don't want to turn back there. But it's Proverbs 3, 9, and 10. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Honor the Lord with your wealth. This means give him the credit for what he's given you. I would say it is simply astonishing how ungrateful people are for a prosperous nation. And we do live in not just a prosperous nation, but friend, one of the most prosperous nations in the history of the world. And the ingratitude that people have for that is astonishing. Obviously, we have one of our political candidates, one of our presidential candidates right now has as his slogan, "Make America Great Again," or maybe he's added it again, I don't know. But, you know, the comeback that people try to have to that is something like, you know, I don't know when America was ever great. Or something like that. Like, that's the height of naivete. I'll tell you, I have, and it's a monstrosity of ingratitude. By God's grace, my family has lived in several other countries. Dick has lived in several other countries. Some of you have lived in other countries. And to not recognize that there is anything worth celebrating or appreciating in our nation is an astonishing act of ingratitude. God has been very, very good to us. And not only for the material prosperity, but for a spiritual, godly heritage in our land. A nation that has, in history, given great freedom to Christians. And that means that, you know, in America's short history, the spiritual biographies, the spiritual riches that have come out of our country in the past 200 years is truly reason to give thanks to God. It's truly incredible. And again, you can live in other countries. We don't have to say, oh, other countries are terrible. I'm so glad I'm American because other countries are terrible, because their food's gross or whatever. It's like, no, that's not why, you know. Other countries can be proud of their heritage as well, but we just have to start with that. We don't have to compare to anybody. You don't have to compare your vineyard to the vineyard down the road. Just say, has God given me a great gift? If you inherited an estate, you don't say, well, I'm not going to be grateful for this estate because Seth's got a better estate than me. No, be grateful for the estate that God has given you. I don't care if you think there's a country in the world that's better than the United States. God has given you an estate. He's given you a wonderful gift, and we ought to be grateful for it. And then look at chapter 23 again. Chapter 23 and verse 24 and 25. The proverb says, the father of a righteous child has great joy. A man who fathers a wise son rejoices in him. May your father and mother rejoice. May she who gave you birth be joyful. Now, this is interesting because what it suggests is we should live in such a way that honors our parents. And this is connected, of course, to the law of Israel, right? One of the 10 Commandments. Honor your father and mother. That does not just mean, and it's not just me saying it. This is literally any theologian in history who studied the 10 Commandments. So we should not be very narrowly saying, like, I gotta make sure I honor my mom and dad and how I live. That's all that matters. Instead, it's showing this connection to our ancestors, and that we live in a way that honors them, that shows respect to them, that recognizes their wisdom and their accomplishments. Right? It is unwise for us to trash our elders as a society. If a society is becoming a place where older people are more and more disrespected, that's a sign that society is headed in the wrong direction. Where older people, I almost said old people, but of course, no one's an old person. There's only older people. Where older people, their wisdom is not received, and what they think about the direction of our country doesn't matter more than anybody else's. That's a sign your nation is headed in an unwise direction, that we are not, in fact, being wise stewards. If we act in ways, let's be honest, like modern pop culture is not only different from our ancestors' culture, it is deeply distressing and repulsive to them. That's a sign we're headed in the wrong direction. If you're spending a lot of time in an environment that would make your grandmother blush, you're in the wrong places. We should be living largely in a way that I could live with my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents by my side. And they would understand what's going on, and they would be honored as I live, right? And frankly, we fail to see, I'm careful not to get hung up at this point, but we fail to see how we are in fact coasting off the work of our ancestors. We're going to talk about this a little bit more next week, but largely, we're calling this series apolitical, which means somebody who's not interested or involved in politics. And I think, frankly, I just think that's what most of us wish we could be. We hear about politics, we start to get a headache, we're just annoyed by it. Like, I got enough going on in my life. I don't want to be thinking about political matters on top of it. Can I just stay away from all of it? But let me tell you, the luxury of not thinking about politics is, in fact, a result of successful politics. Do you think people that live in a banana republic somewhere have the luxury of not caring about what happens in their government? No, the reason that you think that you have the luxury of not really caring that much about the government or about politics or whatever is because we have a long legacy of things going pretty good. We left it on autopilot, and then we try to go to sleep, right? Well, it's true. We've had a lot of good credit built up from previous generations that we actually can coast pretty far on their work, but we can't go to sleep at the wheel. We have a responsibility. It is, in fact, a result of successful politics that we have the luxury of not thinking. But it's like, if you gave an irresponsible teenager a brand new car, right? And they drove it for like 5 years and never changed the oil or anything like that. And you say, you're going to change the oil in this car? He said, I don't think this car needs that. I've never done that before, and I've never had a problem. It's like, well, you don't have a problem yet, but you might have a problem in the future, right? Or if you get a new home, right? Very soon, what does that home need? It needs maintenance, right? You can coast off the luxury of having a new home, but eventually you're going to be like everybody else and you need to do some maintenance. And that's what a wise steward is prepared to do the maintenance necessary to preserve the good things that God has given them. So this includes all this work that our ancestors have given us, includes wealth, freedom, our culture, our land, our good reputation. These are all good gifts from God. And it would be quite foolish as Christians for us to squander those good gifts from God. It would be unwise to be ungrateful or to let those gifts come to nothing. This brings us to preservation. Look back at chapter 21, verse 20. The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down. This is modern American culture in a nutshell. The gulping down is happening everywhere. We're gulping down the good things that have been laid up for us by previous generations. But it says the wise store up choice food and oil. They give thought to the future. They are aware that hard days could be ahead. I find that young people generally have an assumption that our country is too robust to break. And they've got good reason for thinking that. Because things in our nation have been very stable since your parents' generation, and their parents' generation, and their parents' generation. Of course, their parents had a Great Depression, almost starved to death, but let's not think about that too much. We do live in a very robust nation by God's grace. But it would be the height of foolish stewardship for us to assume that it's impossible to break our country. That it's not possible to break it. So we see policies implemented by politicians that are doing just that are putting strain on the nation. They're not storing up good things for our country. They're gulping down the good things that our country has laid up. And the assumption is this is just the way the world is. And friend, what Proverbs would tell you, what anyone who's been around the world or who studied history would tell you is, no, that's not the way the world is at all. It's not the way the world is. And good gifts can come to nothing. Okay. There's also those who believe that there's nothing worth preserving, which is also foolish. So let's look at that little part about the sluggard's vineyard in chapter 24. Chapter 24, verse 30, he says, I went past the field of a sluggard, past the vineyard of someone who has no sense, and thorns had come up everywhere. The ground was covered with weeds, and the stone wall was in ruins. So he talks about, a vineyard is something that you can plant a vineyard today, but you won't be getting anything good out of that vineyard for a long time. A vineyard is generational wealth. That's something that if you own a vineyard, it's because somebody else built that and entrusted it to you. And what it's showing is in one generation, all that good thing that was built up can be completely ruined because of a guy who won't do the maintenance that's required. The stone wall is in ruins. Thorns had come up everywhere. The ground was covered with weeds. And what is this owing to? He calls it the field of a sluggard. And there he says in verse 32, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man. Now I'm looking at largely respectable, middle-class people, some of us more respectable than others, right? But the truth is, this is something most of us, just our kind of social strata or whatever, we understand instinctively about our own, for lack of a better word, portfolios. For our own money that we've got, right? We look around and we see people that are spending money carelessly or whatever. We're like, no, we have a budget. We know how much money we've got, making wise financial decisions. Generally, by and large, people who are sitting here, we're not making the stupid financial decisions that many people in our community are. And that's to our credit. But those same principles apply to this other larger household that we're part of, the nation that we're part of. And what is it? What's the danger? The danger is sloth, a deadly sin of sloth. What is sloth? Sloth is a love of ease, which is another way of saying I like doing nothing so much that I can't make myself do something, right? Or I can't break out of this habit that I'm in to do something good. And that's, he says here, I walked by, I saw the field of a sluggard, past the vineyard of someone who has no sense. If our nation crumbles, and it's only fair to say that what we're seeing is there's a crumbling effect in our nation right now. If our nation crumbles, this is exactly what people around the world and future generations will say. They will say, this is a field of someone who has no sense. Their own sloth, their own unwillingness to act, their own unwillingness to do is what led to this. Many of you have heard the little, I don't know what it's called, little motto or whatever of the Good times make soft men make hard times make strong men make good times, right? Something like that. It's true. That's an accurate observation in the world, and we have to determine where we're at on that cycle. So wisdom often looks like a maintenance guy who's doing hard work. And this is why we don't like politics. This is why we don't like politics. Just one more thing to think about. It's like, I'm doing all I can to keep my own house in order. I'm worn out with that. And now you're telling me there's this other house that I got to take care of as well. So wisdom looks to the past, but I want to see it also looks to the future as well. Look at chapter 13, verse 22. Chapter 13, verse 22. A good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children, but a sinner's wealth is stored up for the righteous. So a good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children. This is not talking about a specific number of generations. Like, hey, make sure you at least leave something for your grandchildren. This is just Proverbs' way of saying a wise person is not only fixated on their own lifespan. They are thinking about, remember we said about wise stewardship, is about passing more, making it increase and passing it on to the next generation better than you found it. And that's what he's saying here. He sees his descendants as part of his family. So you've got to see this. Wise people see their connection to their ancestors and to their posterity. That's not the way modern people live. For the most part, most of us don't know the names of our great-grandparents. And we see a trend in our nation of people who have grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren, keeping resources to themselves rather than empowering the next generation. And Proverbs says it's not the way of wise stewardship. Wise stewardship says, those are my people, and those are my people. I don't ignore either one of them. I honor those who came before me, and I make sure I want to pass on something better to the next generation. So Proverbs is painting this picture of what God made us from. So imagine, if people lived according to the book of Proverbs, what would the world be like? Oh, we would just we'd get better and better and better. I would receive from God good gifts. I would use them wisely. I would make them increase. I would pass them on to the next generation. The next generation would receive that. They'd appreciate it. They would use it wisely. They would make it increase. They'd pass it on to the next generation. So if the world lived according to the book of Proverbs, what would the world be like? It'd be pretty awesome. It'd be pretty amazing what would happen. The people would gain momentum and they would grow great. It would all be based in their fear of the Lord. Generation after generation would fear the Lord, worship him, reinforced by this past history that they share. We're talking about these generational dominoes. The dominoes will get bigger and bigger and bigger as generations live in faithfulness. And this would lead to praise to God. And of course, the rulers of a nation, we'll just talk about this, we'll talk more about this in a couple weeks. The rulers of a nation are supposed to take the lead in this. Right? Ideally, it's what we want in our leaders. We want our leaders to take the lead in wise stewardship. So when we're looking at two potential leaders, as Christians, we're not just trying to say, well, who goes to church more often? We're interested in that, but what we really want to know is who's going to be the better steward of what God has given. And the polar opposite of this is you see a king in Israel's history named King Hezekiah. And King Hezekiah received a message from the Lord of judgment. And he said, because of your nation's disobedience, judgment from the Lord is coming. And Hezekiah said, when's this going to happen? And the prophet said, well, it'll be next generation. And Hezekiah said, oh, okay, no big deal then. He says, as long as there is peace and safety in my time, I'm okay with that. And Hezekiah is recorded for that incredibly foolish attitude in the scriptures. That's the attitude of a fool. It's an attitude of a foolish leader who ultimately will destroy. And this should not be our attitude. That would be a great failure for us. Unfortunately, because of kings like Hezekiah, this generational dominoes of the gifts getting greater and greater and the praise to God getting greater and greater, it did not happen for Israel. No, it came crashing down. Eventually, Israel squandered all the good gifts that God gave them. They lost everything. They lost their inheritance from the Lord. And frankly, it didn't happen for any other nation either. Romans chapter 1 puts it like this, that though we knew God, we did not honor him as God, nor were we thankful for all the things that... So what's our legacy as sinners? Our legacy is not the generational dominoes of receiving from God, making it increase, giving thanks to God, passing it on to the next generation. No. Our legacy is receive some things from God, waste most of them, drop a few of them, not give thanks to God for them, and then hand on one or two of them to the next generation. That's our legacy as sinful people. And we see this right from the very beginning, right? Look at what he says here about the field of he went past the vineyard of someone who has no sense. Thorns had come up everywhere. The ground was covered with weeds. When's the first time that happened? What's the first garden of fruit trees in the Bible? The Garden of Eden, where God planted a vineyard. And he allowed mankind to inherit that wonderful wealth and to make use of it, to honor him with it, to increase and to give thanks to him. And instead, what do? We were not thankful. We lost what we had, right? And instead, what was the ground covered with? Thorns and weeds. The ground is covered with thorns and weeds. So, how is anything going to end up any way besides that? This should be our question as we think about this. Like, how can our generational dominoes lead to anything besides us all being totally bankrupt before God? God's response to our ingratitude was not to take everything away from us. Isn't that what you would do? The more ungrateful your kids are, what's your instinct as a parent? You're so ungrateful, just take more away from you. Just keep taking from you until you learn to be grateful. But God took a somewhat different plan. After God had sent faithful rivers of grace, God sent a tidal wave of grace. Something that would just knock us over and turn us into grateful people. And of course, I'm speaking of him sending his son, the Lord Jesus Christ, as the superabundance of grace. He sent a new king who took responsibility for the entire race of man. Only Jesus received gifts from the Father, never dropped a single one of them, completely honored the Father in how he lived and how he used what the Father had given him. And because he did that, he received more. Now, did he increase? Oh yeah, he increased. Jesus, after his resurrection, he said, all power, all authority is given to me in heaven and on earth. As we saw in the book of Revelation, he has been made the king over all the nations of the world. All the nations are his inheritance. Simply put, what does Jesus want? He has made what the Father has given him grow and increase until he owns everything. And just like our faithful, wise steward we're talking about here in Proverbs, he hands it to his posterity. He hands it to us. He hands it to his people. He enriches us. He, for us, earned the whole world and secured it for us forever. I think it's amazing that that story of Jesus parallels what almost any country's national heroes are like. Now, it's not just America that has national heroes. Any country that's worth anything has national heroes. And here's what all national heroes have in common, pretty much. Whether they're, a soldier that serves in a modern war, or whether they're one of our founding fathers or whatever. Here's what a national hero does. A national hero acts in a sacrificial way. They put themselves on the line so that later on down the road we can say, we have today what we have because of that person's sacrificial actions. Isn't that interesting? That should sound a whole lot like the gospel of Jesus Christ. See that? Isn't that amazing? A nation is preserved and built and blessed by gospel-shaped actions. By somebody acting out the gospel. That's how the world is built. And that, I think, tells us a little something about what God is teaching us through this drama of nations. What is he teaching us in this household? He's teaching us that we receive all these good gifts through the sacrificial acts of those who have gone before us. This gift that Jesus Christ has given us, it changes us forever. It changes us. It makes us into the right kind of recipients. By the way, Jesus on the cross, what do we see Jesus on the cross? Jesus on the cross, that's what it looks like when you've lost your last gift. When you finally squandered every last thing that God has given you and you end up dead and dry and thirsty and lifeless. The cross. That's what it looks like. The judgment of God. Jesus did that so that he could secure the world for a disobedient race of sinners like us. And when we receive this gift, it transforms us and it changes us into the right kind of recipients. As the Apostle Paul says, we do not receive the grace of God in vain. When I receive the grace of God, what does it make me do? Stop being a sluggard. It makes me stop being a sloth, Paul says. I labor more abundantly than anybody, Paul says. Paul says, I work. I do work, and I do good works in my life because I've received the grace of God. This special grace changes how I receive the common grace of a good nation and other inheritances. Christ, we might say it like this, Christ has made a people who could build the best of nations. And if you're wondering, this is one of my favorite things to study in history is just how our civilization that we think of as normal. We just think this is how civilizations are. Literally, the entire modern world is built on the cross. It is built on Christianity. You remove the influence of Christianity from this world, and we're all back in the Stone Age. Okay. It is the gospel of Jesus Christ that has lifted nations out of their doom spiral, out of their own gift squandering. So, while being an American does not make us a Christian, being a Christian makes us, hopefully, the best kind of American. We receive God's grace. Christ made a people who could build the best of nations. And by the way, Christ makes people that can be the best of leaders. That's why it's not a silly thing to want your leaders to be Christians. It's not silly. We're going to talk about that in a couple weeks. It's not silly at all to want your leaders to be Christian. Because you're saying, I believe Christ Jesus. Go ahead, make your list today. What would be the ideal kind of citizen to be? And what would be the ideal kind of leader? Make a list of all the character traits to think of. I bet wise is on the list. You want a wise citizenry and you want a wise leadership. Where's that wisdom going to come from? It's going to start with those who fear the Lord. So Christ makes people who can make the best of nations and in fact build the world that we live in. Very famously, 200 years ago in October, like this one, President John Adams was writing to the militia of, I think it's Massachusetts, I think. And he was praising them for something. He was praising them for their character. That they were acting honorably, which is a category our society has largely lost. And John Adams, he's speculating about the future of a country. Of course, the country's like 20 years old. He's speculating about the future of the country. And he says, he basically has an experience, he says, if we become a hypocrite country, that we talk a lot of Christian stuff, but our actions are filled with all sorts of immoral actions, he says, this country will become the most miserable habitation in the world. Why? Listen what he says. Because we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. He says, we don't have any government power that is capable of dealing with people if not morality and religion anchoring them and changing their character. And then very famous, he says, avarice, that's greed, ambition, revenge, etc. These kind of vices would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. He's like, you think your little Constitution's going to hold back people once they've abandoned God and abandoned religion? Look at our nation. No, he says they'll go right through that Constitution like a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution, this is his famous line, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So our government has no power to deal with people if the people as a whole are not being led by morality and by religion. And how true his words are. And that's why Christ Jesus' gift to us, the inheritance that he has given us by his grace, makes all the difference. So friend, what are you doing and what are you willing to do to preserve his gifts? What I want to I want to do a couple things in this series. The first one is to inform and teach and instruct about what we should do. The other thing I really want to do is just to take the leash off. Because there are many Christians who feel like because I'm a Christian, I shouldn't be that involved with politics or the world or the government or anything. It would be more spiritual for me just to stay out of all that. And we'll talk about that next week. But it's a natural thing for you to care about the house you live in. And I think for men especially, it's a natural thing for us to be concerned and to care about the political process. And what I want to do is to unleash you, or to let you know that that's a very good desire, according to Proverbs, a wise desire. And I want to awaken this will. I want to awaken a will that determines, yes, I do want to make the difference that I'm able to make. Now, I think we often have a feeling of helplessness. Like, our country's so big and I'm so small. Like, what in the world could we do that's any different? Or what difference can Christians make? Aren't Christians doing all that we can do? No. The last presidential election was decided by 42,000 votes. Josh Howerton shared a stat. I don't know if it's true. I'm going to share an article with you next week when I got this stat. Josh Howerton shared a stat that said in the last presidential election, 30 million Bible-believing Christians did not cast a vote. What is that? That is the field of the sluggard, the vineyard of one who has no sense, the person that cannot be troubled in their will. They cannot be troubled to rise up and do something about their own future. So beware of sloth, which will keep you from passing on a godly legacy. I want to commend you for being part of a church plant. You don't often get that commendation, but I want to commend you for it because it's hard. It's what it is. It's an act of the will. It's that said, I'm going to leave a legacy. And I commend our older saints in our congregation for doing something that's saying, I'm leaving a legacy. One of the reasons we plant a church is to say, I'm going to establish something for my next generation and the generation after that. I'm working to build something that will bless future generations, something that I can hand off to them. So let's build this church. Let's build our communities. Let's build our families. Let's build our nation with good laws and good elections. Now, if you're not a Christian, if you're an unbeliever, I think most of us here are Christians, and so I'll just share this with you. There's a growing number of people in our country who are recognizing that there's a trajectory in our government that's very disturbing. And so they're becoming what we might call conservative. They're coming over to a conservative viewpoint, which as Christians, we're like, yeah, we've been over here. We like it over here. You should come over here. This is the wise side to be on. We want to be on the conservative side. We want to conserve, right? Preserve the good gifts that God has given us. But this is an opportunity for us as Christians to evangelize. Because those people are coming over and they're saying, yeah, I want to fight for what you Christians say you've been fighting for. But they want to do that without bowing the knee to Christ, right? They're not interested in adopting. So many people who are very passionate about their conservative political views still have nothing to do with God. Christ is not the Lord of their life. And they are still the person that John Adams is talking about. They are still a person unbridled by morality and religion. And our message then needs to be in love to say, listen, I see that you see this problem. That you want to be part of the solution, but it's important that you know without Christ, you're part of the problem. You're not part of the solution. Without the fear of the Lord, you are still living a fundamentally ungrateful life. Living a fundamentally non-conservative life. And you are rebelling against the highest King. Let's pray together.